Hi, everybody. Welcome to Cannabis Policy at a Crossroads updates on rescheduling and reform 2024 and 2025. Thank you for joining my session. My name is Ron Brooks, and I'm the owner and principal consultant for Ron Brooks Consulting. Today, we'll explore the rapidly evolving landscape of cannabis policy in the United States. So, over the next 30 minutes or so, I'll provide a big picture update of where cannabis policy stands in federal and state levels, some recent changes and challenges, and what may lie ahead. The goal here is to equip you with a clear understanding of the current cannabis regulations and their implications at a high level. As the title suggests, cannabis policy is truly at a crossroads with significant reforms underway and hopefully underway. So let's dive in by outlining what we're going to cover today. Now, we'll start with federal policy developments, focusing on the push to reschedule cannabis under federal law and what that really entails. Then we're going to review state level trends, looking at which states have legalized cannabis for medical and recreational use in 2024 and 25, and how this patchwork of laws is really evolving. Next, we're going to discuss implications for various stakeholders. This includes taxation, economic impacts on the industry, regulatory compliance updates, and what these changes mean for businesses and medical patients and consumers. We'll pay some special attention to social equity programs, examining their purpose and the challenges they face in practice. And then finally, we're going to conclude with a future outlook, discussing potential upcoming reforms, banking access and potentially interstate commerce, and then some recommendations and next steps for industry stakeholders. Throughout, I'll be highlighting some facts, some data, and I really look forward to helping you learn more about where we currently stand in the US. Now, these are our learning objectives. First, you should come away today understanding the federal rescheduling effort, what it means to go from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, and why that really matters. Second, you'll be able to identify and recall key state level changes that have occurred in 2024 and early 25. For example, which new states have legalized cannabis or have launched programs and what that means on the ground. Third, you'll gain some insight into social equity programs in the cannabis space, why they were created, how they're being implemented, and what challenges they face. In short, we're aiming to provide, a well-rounded update from federal law to state laws and societal impacts. Keeping these objectives in mind will help frame the detailed information that we're going to cover today. First is cannabis policy in the US. As you can see, this is just kind of a map of where we are, and we're going to come back to this in a little bit. But the biggest thing to remember here is that on a federal level, cannabis remains to be a Schedule 1 controlled substance under the Controlled Substances Act. Even though we've got 39 of 50 states with a medical program and 24 states with recreational use, and then the hemp laws, obviously, we see a lot of change. Now, let's walk through a timeline of what's happened recently with the federal rescheduling effort. Now, we know cannabis has been a classified Schedule 1 controlled substance since 1970, which is the strictest category meant for drugs with no accepted medical use, and a high potential for abuse. Now, back in October of 22, I know we're focusing 24 to 25, but we got to go back to 22 here. President Biden took an unprecedented step of asking the Department of Health and Human Services and the Attorney General to review cannabis scheduling. This really set into motion a scientific evaluation by the FDA under HHS. So let's fast forward to August of 23. HHS made the historic recommendation that based on a review of evidence, they advised the DEA to reschedule cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. Now, this was a pivotal moment. HHS essentially acknowledged that cannabis has medical uses and a lower risk of abuse than Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 substances. Now, following that in May of 24, the DOJ and the DEA took, action on the recommendation. The Attorney General submitted a notice of proposed rulemaking to the Federal Register to formally initiate cannabis's rescheduling to Schedule 3. This kicked off a official rulemaking process, which included a 60-day public comment period through mid-24. Now, the response with public comments was huge. There were over 42,000 comments that were sent in this rulemaking process, including numerous requests to be able to appear at hearings. Then late 2024, the process moved to really the administrative hearing stage. So under the Controlled Substances Act, the DEA must hold a hearing to gather evidence on the record for such changes. Now, the DEA, October of 24, they select some participants for this hearing, but then subsequently there is a motion to disqualify the DEA from this rulemaking process in November. There's a lot there that we really don't have time to unpack. But while there was a hearing date set in December for January 21st of 2025, as of 2025, the hearing had been stayed. There has been no updates from the current administration. So more or less at this point, rescheduling is in a holding pattern. Hopefully something happens. It remains to be seen. But what I want to talk about now are the implications of what happens if cannabis is rescheduled to Schedule 3. And as I've alluded to earlier, one of the most critical points of all of this, it's not just symbolic. It really does have practical implications. First, the Schedule 3 classification inherently means that the government is recognizing an accepted medical use for cannabis. Now, this is a huge shift in the federal stance. It would align federal policy more with what the states are currently saying with medical cannabis. In essence, the DEA and the FDA would be saying cannabis has medical value, which would encourage, hopefully, healthcare professionals and institutions to engage more with cannabis-based treatment options. Now, one of the biggest immediate impacts would be on taxation. Many of you might know of the Internal Revenue Code 280E. This has been the bane of existence for cannabis businesses. Now, because cannabis is Schedule 1, state legal cannabis companies cannot deduct normal business expenses on their federal taxes, resulting in astronomically high effective tax rates. Now, if cannabis becomes a Schedule 3, in theory, 280E would no longer apply. Now, this change alone would be transformative for the industry's finances. Now, imagine suddenly being able to write off rents and salaries and other expenses like a normal business could do. Now, this could make struggling dispensaries and, product manufacturers more viable virtually overnight. So we have law firm analysis noting, tax reliefs would be monumental for cannabis business. So we can only hope that this happens. Next implication would be on research in medicine. Schedule 1 status severely restricts scientific research. More or less everything has to go through the Institutes of Drug Abuse if you want to do a study on cannabis. So it has to have that focus. Now, Schedule 3, we should see less hindrance. It should be less stringent. This could open the floodgates for more clinical trials and development of cannabis-derived medications. We might see, for example, pharmaceutical interest isolating cannabinoids for treatments of conditions. We already have Marinol. It has its own places for helping in nausea, but rescheduling whole cannabis could encourage more FDA-approved therapies in the future. Hopefully, too, doctors might become more comfortable in discussing cannabis with their patients, especially the ones that aren't already. And also, it could allow for federal agencies like the VA to then explore cannabis treatment options for veterans once it is Schedule 3. Although there are going to be some other barriers that remain, and we can talk about that in a little bit. Now, I have to emphasize this. Rescheduling is not legalization. Let me repeat, rescheduling is not legalization. Now, if the DEA reschedules cannabis, it'll remain illegal to possess or sell marijuana without authorization. It's just under a different schedule. So practically, Federal agents aren't going to start arresting state licensed dispensary owners for Schedule 3 violations, or at least we hope that doesn't happen, just as they really haven't done under Schedule 1 due to DOJ policies. But the laws on the books would still say that cannabis is illegal. Also, crossing state lines with cannabis would still remain illegal under federal law, since each state market is really isolated. So it's kind of the double-edged sword here. So state legal businesses still won't be able to ship products. Again, we're still treated like differently than most other businesses because we're still not legal. Lastly, and this is kind of a nuanced point, some advocates actually worry that rescheduling would slow down broader reforms. Now, the thinking is, if the federal government, does something like rescheduling, then lawmakers might pat themselves on the back and, lose the urgency for tackling comprehensive legislation, or even going further on social justice issues, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. It is possible that Congress might say, hey, we fixed it, and not push things further. Now, of course, others see rescheduling as a step toward eventual legalization, a sign that the federal government is finally coming around. We'll talk a little bit more about, what Congress is considering here on the next slide. Federal policies beyond rescheduling. So we've seen a number of policies over the years. So aside from this administrative rescheduling process, Congress has the ability to act. One of the most significant federal proposals in recent years has been the Safer Banking Act. Originally known as the Safe Banking Act, they added the R because they made some revisions. So now the Safer Banking Act. This was actually bipartisan legislation, which has been laser focused on banking issues. So right now, because cannabis is federally illegal, a lot of banks still refuse to do work with cannabis businesses. I think that's currently about 10% of the banks and 5% of credit unions in the U.S. Will currently serve the cannabis industries, and the ones that do, the fees are typically quite high, just because it creates such a compliance hassle. So the result here, you've got state legal cannabis companies that have to operate largely in cash. The Safer Banking Act would protect banks and insurers from federal prosecution for simply working with state legal cannabis clients. This bill has been introduced repeatedly. In September of 23, it actually passed the Senate Banking Committee with, again, bipartisan support. Something that doesn't happen very often. It passed with bipartisan support. It's the furthest it's ever gotten in the Senate. It's optimistic that Congress may take up the Safer Banking Act again this year, but at this point, that remains to be seen. Beyond banking, there have been other comprehensive reform bills. One specifically is the MORE Act. More or less, the MORE Act, the aim there is to remove cannabis entirely from the Controlled Substances Act. So in essence, descheduling cannabis and to set up social equity programs at the federal level. Now, we know the current administration's policy on DEI, so how they're going to treat social equity remains to be seen. But this policy has seen a couple times, but again, it hasn't really gone too far. Um, it doesn't seem like Congress is up for full legalization, though. Again, there have been hints at it. Another federal action area is, criminal record relief. President Biden's pardon of simple possession was symbolic, but it also was meaningful for those affected, pardoning several thousand individuals for federal offenses. However, most marijuana arrests have occurred at the state level, and federal pardons do nothing at the state level. Now, could there be state level expungements? Yes, and hopefully with some rescheduling, we would see that. And finally, other federal measures, things like the Veterans Equal Access Act, where veterans would have access in the VA to cannabis, which, we've seen studies that it's more beneficial than, treating with opiates and things like that. The Veterans Equal Access Act would allow that to be a possibility at the VA. There's also been the Medical Marijuana Research Act that had passed, um, which actually allowed for more research grade cannabis to be grown outside of the University of Mississippi. So that's positive. And there's also the international law angle where cannabis is restricted by international drug treaties. So that complicates descheduling somewhat. So really, to sum up the section, while administrative rescheduling was moving forward, Congress has been engaged with the cannabis issue for a while. The likely scenario is, maybe we'll keep seeing some incremental legislation, but hopefully we see something more large scale. Now let's turn our shift to the state landscape. Now, again, we've seen this map before. For good reason. This tells the story of the individual states. So it's pretty remarkable right now that a majority of Americans live in a state with some form of federal or of legal cannabis. To break it down, again, 24 states and the District of Columbia allow full adult use recreational cannabis. And that was as of the end of 2024. We've got 39 states that have medical programs and in some form or the other. We've got Alabama who, they have a medical program, but it's tied up in lawsuits right now. So those state patients that would otherwise benefit haven't been able to get to their medicine yet. We saw this start on the West Coast and it's ventured its way east. Mississippi now has a medical program. Kentucky has a medical program. We'll talk about a few more of these in a little bit. But it's interesting that every year, we're seeing more and more and more. So right now, really the big picture, state policies have been leading the way on cannabis reform. It is a patchwork system, so it makes it challenging for operators and regulators, but it also provides a real world experiment in cannabis policy. Um, we've got 24 different recreational frameworks. We've got almost 40 different medical frameworks out there. So stakeholders have to navigate the approach state by state. This is cumbersome and it creates a lot of other issues here. So let's talk about some specifics, which states have made some changes and how those changes have happened. So we're going to step back to 2023 again here. We had a lot of success with cannabis policies being put on the books in 23. We saw Ohio's legalization of recreational cannabis via a ballot initiative in November of 23. So Ohio voters approved issue 2, making Ohio the 7th most populous state to legalize cannabis for adult use. Now, this was significant because it's one of the first Midwestern states to do so by a voter initiative. Now, we know Illinois and Michigan already had legalized it, but Ohio pushes that further east. Minnesota in May of 23, the state legislature legalized recreational cannabis and the governor signed it. The laws took effect August 1st of 23, which allowed adults to possess certain amounts, and it allowed home grow, which I think every state should have. So Minnesota plans to begin selling recreational this year. Delaware, in April of 23, Delaware finally legalized recreational cannabis through its legislature. Now, this had been a long battle. The governor had vetoed a similar measure before, but lawmakers were actually able to override that veto. Now, their approach is somewhat cautious with possession limits at like 1 ounce. But like Minnesota, they're in the process of really establishing their regulatory infrastructure for sales. And we should see the launch of that market here on April 1st, if it hasn't already done so already. We've also seen medical cannabis expansion. As I mentioned before, I talked about Alabama, I've talked about Mississippi, but Kentucky passing medical cannabis is near and dear to my heart. Went to college and graduate school in Kentucky. So, it's a medical program, which, is a big deal for a Southern state. This program is going to be limited, no smokable flowers, only vapes and edibles and oils and things like that. But it is a start. It's a start somewhere for a state with a rich history in cannabis. You know, However, with the success in 23, we had some disappointments in 24. North Dakota and South Dakota rejected adult use cannabis. Florida had a ballot initiative, even though 56% of voters wanted to have adult use cannabis. This ballot measure needed to reach a 60% threshold, and it was 4% short. Um, and that's sad. We also saw in Arkansas the courts override what the voters decided with cannabis. So again, disappointments. But again, this year in 2025, we've got the launch of Kentucky's program. Delaware is launching their program, and I think what we're seeing in the background is with more states coming on board, we're also seeing states start to ban intoxicating hemp products. Texas is one of name that just recently did this. Their Senate passed a bill as uh, gas station hemp has popped up everywhere in Texas. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in just a minute. Now, one tangible benefit that's often cited with cannabis legalization is the generation of tax revenue. So let's talk about numbers and trends just for a few minutes. Now, since the first adult use stores opened in 2024 in Colorado and Washington, states have collectively brought in over $20 billion in cannabis tax revenue. And this was as of early 2024. That's huge. Really, really big. In 23 alone, states collected more than 4 billion in cannabis taxes. So, where do all these tax dollars go? Well, again, we've got a hodgepodge of networks. So every state does it a little bit different. Some are making allocations toward public education, some toward healthcare and drug treatment, or public safety or infrastructure. Again, every state being a little different. Some take some of these funds to help benefit social equity. So a social equity reinvestment is also a growing use. So policymakers are trying to find the best uses for these funds. Do they always? We may not agree, but that remains to be seen. But I think the biggest thing here, yes, we're generating a lot of taxes, but tax policy design is huge. Depending on how a state is taxing, it could benefit or can really harm the marketplace and the businesses. High taxes, what we found, will drive consumers to the illicit market because in times like these where we've had inflation and other things take place, consumers don't have as much money. And if a high tax structure is in place, or like in California where you had a cultivation tax and it's a tax on a tax on a tax on a tax, you are going to divert otherwise willing customers to the black market just to save a dollar. Everybody's got to take care of themselves, and again, cannabis, we have to admit, is still, even though medically in some places can be considered a vice industry. Now, like I said, every state has dealt with taxes differently, but an emerging topic here and to think about with rescheduling or with any legalization or decriminalization effort is federal taxation. So will these tax policies hold if we have a federal tax in place? That we don't know. But I think one thing that's also worth mentioning here is how cannabis legalization has an economic ripple effect that's beyond taxes. It creates jobs. So not only directly in like cultivation or retail or ancillary sectors like laboratories or say even equipment suppliers. By some estimates, legal cannabis is one of the fastest growing job sectors in the country. Moreover, it's reduced cost on law enforcement and the judicial side with not having to have so many arrests or incarcerations. So in summary, cannabis is providing a new revenue system for most of these states, which are quite happy bringing in new revenue. Now, how we compare states is a little bit differently, but hopefully, we will see some sort of reduction with states that are overtaxing to help further our businesses here. Now, we do have other regulatory updates that have happened at the state level. Um, you know, Sometimes broad strokes, sometimes little strokes, but it's constantly in flux. I think some of the biggest changes we've seen recently are increased compliance trends and enhanced product safety testing. So as our industry really matures, the states are starting to refine their quality control requirements. Virtually all states require cannabis products to be lab tested, for potency, for contaminants. Now we're seeing states in take their initial regulation and start to enhance them. We've seen Colorado update their rules to add additional pesticides that weren't previously screened for. California's made changes. California's implemented a standardized potency method. Other states have done the same thing. So we're seeing, some standardization happen. We've seen in Montana expanded their pesticide list, more than doubled the pesticides that they are requiring in their program. So we're seeing this in many, many states. What we're also seeing is, a movement toward the standardization of lab results on labels. So, ensuring THC content is displayed clearly and that labs are certified to a high standard so that results are reliable. I've heard, working a lot with laboratories, I hear a lot about, potency inflation and things like that. And, we've talked about that in previous discussions, but um, you know, regulators are upping their game. With that, we've seen enforcement against unlicensed operations. We've seen that in California taking down illegal grows that aren't licensed. We've seen that in New York with New York going after illegal dispensaries. People get fines, things like that. Hopefully there is some sort of aim there that will help benefit, licensed businesses that are trying to do this the right way. And speaking of trying to do it the right way, then we have to talk about the hemp-derived THC loophole closure. So, this really became a huge story around 2021, 2022, and it's really continued. Now, hemp, with the 2018 Farm Bill was legalized, and let's remember it has less than 0.3% Delta 9 THC. But that Farm Bill, with the loophole it created, has now allowed for other forms of THC, Delta 8, Delta 10, which are synthesized from CBD. We're seeing these in gas stations. We're seeing them flood online stores that often have no age checks. These products aren't tested. There's no testing framework for it. So we've seen a lot of states now take this into their own hands. Minnesota's legalization law in 2023 tackled it by limiting THC in any hemp edible to 5 milligrams per serving. I just mentioned Texas. Texas Senate just passed a bill to essentially legalize or criminalize hemp-derived products, so intoxicating cannabinoids. So we're seeing states take this into their own hands. So how that plays out will remain to be seen. But again, because we have federal prohibition, we have companies that are taking advantage of loopholes and then putting unsafe products out onto the market. Now, social equity programs. This is one of the major themes in cannabis policy in recent years. Now, as legalization continues, policymakers have recognized that people who suffered under past cannabis prohibition shouldn't be left out of the process. They should have the economic opportunity to be involved. And some people will even say they should be the first in line. So let's clearly define it. Cannabis social equity programs are initiatives that are intended to promote participation in the legal cannabis industry by individuals and communities that were harmed disproportionately through marijuana criminalization. Now, the rationale here is rooted in justice, like the war on drugs, particularly from the 70s through the 2000s. We saw heavily skewed enforcement against people of color and low-income communities. There's a well-documented stat that nationally, Black Americans have been about 3.7 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis possession than white Americans, even though usage rates are comparable. And we've seen that higher in big cities. In New York, before decriminalization, it wasn't uncommon to see 8 out of 10 marijuana arrests be of Black or Latino individuals. We've seen, the result of generations of Black and brown communities bearing the brunt of criminal records and jail time and the associated economic and societal fallout, lost job opportunities, housing, etc. Now, meanwhile, the cannabis industry, starting to become a lucrative industry, it's often wealthier, non-afflicted folks, and yes, often white males with access to capital who are primed to take advantage of the new market. This dynamic was obvious early on. By the late 20 teens, reports show that ownership of cannabis businesses was overwhelmingly white. There's some estimations that say over 80%. And both racial and gender diversity in leadership was lacking and honestly still is lacking. Not as much as it was, but it still is. And so, why were these social equity programs put into place? It's exactly that, so that those individuals um, can actually have a step up to succeed in an industry that had one time criminalized them. So, how is this happening? A couple of ways. There's priority licensing and set asides for social equity applicants. Um, potentially fee waivers and technical assistance in the application process. Another way is financial and funding help. Some states have tried offering, low interest loans or grants. This one way to do it. And then, we've also had community reinvestment and expungement of records on state level. So the intent is clear, that legal cannabis boom shouldn't just enrich those who've been fortunate enough not to get caught up. Like, it should be inclusive of who were punished under the old laws. And ideally, we should help repay those communities that were torn apart by mass incarceration and enforcement disparities. Enforcement disparities. Now, in practice, how well is this working? Well, that kind of varies state by state. Um, the biggest barrier, not only for social equity applicants, but for the cannabis industry as a whole, has been access to capital. It really is the number one challenge. We can't get traditional loans because federally cannabis is still illegal. And investors are weary, and equity applicants typically lack that personal wealth that can fund an operation indefinitely until something comes on. Which that leads me to point two, with regulatory hurdles and delays and program adjustments. When you have licenses that aren't awarded for equity applicants and delays and program adjustments where they have to resubmit or to redo more things, it's going to slow that down. And especially if these applicants lack, again, that personal wealth or that financial backing, it's just going to further put them out of business. And lastly, we've got market pressures, and the market pressures are hurting everyone. So let's suppose an equity dispensary does manage to get open. They still have to compete in the market. So if the state has a limited number of total stores and they're one of the first, they might do well. But eventually, competition is going to increase. And if this entity isn't well funded, if they don't have that extra little support there, you know, we're going to see more closures. And, that's just not good. Um, so, really, the upshot is that social equity remains a work in progress. Nearly everyone in the policy sphere agrees on the importance of the goal, a cannabis industry that looks more like the community, including those harmed by prohibition. But achieving this is proving difficult. And a reminder that writing an equity program into law is one thing, but making it successful requires ongoing support, resources, and adjustment as we learn what works. Um, Beyond social equity, um, when we're talking about rescheduling, descheduling, legalization, what are our big implications on cannabis businesses? Um, we've discussed very real impacts, but what does it really look like? At this point, the biggest one I think would be tax relief being on the horizon. I think federal rescheduling and tax relief is going to play huge for everyone. I hope that this happens, because it would be nice for our businesses to be treated like normal businesses and have lower effective tax rates. That comes, having that relief, we get banking and more investments. On the banking side, for banks to be able to do business with cannabis businesses and not fear repercussions, to not have, credit card processing get cut offline, or to make it even feasible. Um, That would be nice. It would help all our businesses at this point. You know, there's also regulatory complexity. So every state has its own rules and implications. If we have federal legalization, um, we can reduce that complexity. We can reduce costs. This can lead to interstate commerce. So then we have interstate commerce, and you can operate on two sides of a state line and actually shift products back and forth. Um, Ideally, that would be nice to be treated like every other business, and at this point, it only makes sense because, when we cast our eyes to the future, what do the next couple of years really hold? One of the clearest indicators for what's to come, I think, is public opinion. And now, as shown by this Gallup poll I'm presenting here, we see that, starting from the late 60s to 2023, support for cannabis legalization has only increased. That trend goes up. We have almost 70% of the country at this point wanting legal cannabis. I think, we're seeing this become, less of a partisan issue on the state levels. There still is a little bit, um, but we have sustained support. So we can only hope that with the sustained support, our elected officials will listen to us. Now, by 2025 and 2026, like, I wouldn't be surprised if we have, 30 states with recreational laws. It'd be nice to see something in Florida. At that point, we're going to have two-thirds of Americans that would live in rec legal states. We might see every state have at least a CBD or medical law on place. That would be nice. But on the federal landscape, what are we really going to see? Are we going to have some federal action? Maybe Congress is going to step up and do something. Maybe we might see executive action. This current administration likes the executive order. So, maybe we could see something along that end. The support is there. But also, we run the risk of it's just going to be more of the same. Just kick the can down the road. Um, no desire to take it up. This current administration, we don't know. So the next few years remain a question mark there. Now, state level reforms, states have been leading the charge. Will we see more states adopt cannabis? I think so. Will we see more states start passing bans on intoxicating hemp and synthetic cannabinoids? I think so too. I think there's a real danger there, especially if these products are not tested. There's a damage to public health that can happen. So I think we need to get more control of that. Um, Now, interstate and international trends. Will the US actually get left behind in the next few years? We've got Germany that's stepping up. We see a lot happening in Spain as well. So, will European countries step above the US to do more from a cannabis legalization side? Or is this something that tariffs is going to poo-poo for all of us? We just don't know. And I think one of the biggest challenges to watch and continue to watch is money, access to money, businesses running out of money. Uh, you know, this is going to happen. We'll probably see some mergers and acquisitions happen along the way. Um, but I think the biggest takeaway here, um, and next step for stakeholders, is you got to stay engaged and stay informed. We should continue a collaborative, research-driven approach. Stakeholders from all sides. I'm talking industry, health, community, law enforcement. They all need to communicate. These entities need to put egos aside and let's do something for the common good. Public health experts, we've seen that have guided, packaging and advertising rules. Industry experts, help with identifying practical tweaks to regulations to still help achieve policy goals. We can work together collectively to benefit our industry as it matures. So really, as we stand at this crossroads, the general trajectory is clear. There's more acceptance. We need more regulation, in the sense of, formalizing our industry, not to be exactly like, but to be more like, alcohol and pharma, and more integration into the economy where we can participate like the rest of the businesses out there. Um, it's an exciting time, and it's also a critical one to ensure that we do this right, that we maximize benefits like economic growth, personal freedoms, and medical relief, while also minimizing harms like youth misuse and corporate overconsolidation. You all, I appreciate your time today. I hope that you're able to take a renewed sense of where the U.S. is headed in a policy direction for cannabis, both at the federal and state levels, and just keep your ears open. If there's a chance to participate and you're a stakeholder, my advice here is participate, become engaged, get out there, and it's going to help us all. I thank you all. Have a great day. And if there are any questions, send them my way. My information should be provided after this. Thank you so much.